Starting off, we know that the first round has three absolute superstars. And then the approach that we took at the running back position was to say, we're in on Jonathan Taylor and Christian McCaffrey, as are almost everyone. The 1 and 2, we think that that's justified. But then we were a little bit less enthusiastic about most of the rest of the first round at running back. Not to say those aren't good players, that they couldn't have good seasons, but they didn't exactly fit what we're looking for from a first round pick. Is it safe to say then that Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, those are going to be our guys in the middle of the first round?
Yep. Yeah, good chat there. There's not, you said to me before the show, we don't need to dwell on this too much, and I think you're absolutely right. These are very straightforward picks. I think Jefferson and Chase fit everything that we do in terms of these young, just elite talents. Kupp is, the sort of late bloomer. There's a little bit of, Stephon Diggs circa 2021, where you get this career year kind of late into his career. For Diggs, he didn't match it necessarily in 2022. I was saying last offseason, I was expecting Diggs to go on an Antonio Brown like 3 or 4 season run where he could be the overall wide receiver 1. I'm sort of expecting the same from Cooper Kupp. I'm not, and I'm back in on Diggs this year as well. I don't necessarily think last year for Diggs is a reason to be out on Kupp, and I don't think it's a reason to be out on Diggs either.
Yeah, you look at Kupp and averaging over 11.5 targets a game, almost 115 yards a game, almost a touchdown a game. His air conversion numbers, in part because he's a little bit more of an underneath guy, but not as underneath perhaps as the perception. His racer, 1.17, pretty crazy, averaging 50 yards after the catch per game. These are the kinds of crazy numbers that get you up to a 25-point per game season at the wide receiver position. He's not going to match that, but he can lose a lot of points and still be number 1, the wide receiver 1, and number 2, just such an easy first round pick.
Yeah, no question. So as we move into the second round receivers, when we were talking a little bit before the show, I think there's a lot of concern about all of these players. We have in current ADP, Davante Adams going on average over at FFPC at the 201. He certainly goes in the first round in a lot of formats. Stephon Diggs going at the 202. Their wide receivers 4 and 5. CeeDee Lamb checks in at wide receiver 6 early in the second round. And then you get into the late part of the second round, you have Deebo Samuel, wide receiver 7, Tyreek Hill, wide receiver 8. And then early into the third, you get the Mike Evans, A.J. Brown, T. Higgins group. I think this is a really interesting – I stretch it all the way to A.J. Brown and T. Higgins because for me, I think I can make a pretty strong case that A.J. Brown and T. Higgins are not much different than the guys that are going in the early second round in terms of our expectations. I was saying to you before the show that it's interesting to me that drafters have moved a lot further down on Tyreek Hill than Davante Adams, sort of relative to their ADPs last year or their early offseason ADPs before both of them were traded. My reasoning there being that Tyreek Hill is a guy who has this elite athleticism, these traits that might be less, team specific. Certainly, I agree with your take from this earlier this offseason that we also might find out that Patrick Mahomes was a lot more of Tyreek Hill's success than thought. But if he gets a little bit of Deebo Samuel usage in the Mike McDaniel offense with Miami, he's a tough guy to stop in the open field. And so there's a lot of stuff he can probably create on his own. Meanwhile, Adams has elite skills. He's an elite route runner, but he doesn't really have elite athleticism. There's a familiarity with Derek Carr, but the sort of preternatural connection he had with Aaron Rodgers was second to none in the NFL over the last several years. There's got to be at least a little bit of a concern there. I guess maybe I'm fine with Tyreek Hill going where he is. I'm a little bit uncomfortable taking Davante Adams at the 1-2 turn.
And you mentioned the athleticism there. There's a gigantic gulf in terms of the pure straight line speed between these two players. But it is easy to overlook the combination of agility and leaping ability that Adams brings to the table. He scores very well in those two categories, or at least he did at one point. I mean, these are older players now. And Tyreek Hill, the Jets are obviously still there. With Adams, I mean, I just think he's the better player. And he was less stoppable last season with the Packers than Hill was with the Chiefs. Obviously, similar quarterback play, at least from the perspective of these two guys, are both among the all-time greats. Aaron Rodgers over time, Patrick Mahomes obviously already. And you look at Adams, a target more per game, actually has a little bit more in terms of air yards per game. He very surprisingly generated more yards after the catch per game. I like him as the superior player. You mentioned the route running. You got the size. You've got that leaping ability. And Derek Carr was actually very good last season. We covered him, sort of jokingly. He was one of our debate guys in the QB show. It's a downgrade, and there's no question it's a downgrade. If Davante Adams were still with the Green Bay Packers, he would be in that mix with those clear first-round guys, probably the fourth of the four, but maybe not even that. Maybe he's number two, right? So he does drop down some, but I think this is actually kind of a stealthy, good, we won't say great, but position for him to land in. He has Darren Waller now to draw some defensive attention. Maybe a tiny little fly in the ointment is that Hunter Renfrow was very good at drawing targets last season. And now we go into this offense with Josh McDaniels, where number one, there's always the chance that he brings the run heavy approach that they've used recently in New England. I would think with the weapons they have at their disposal, and you look at the seasons where the Patriots were the most dominant, that they would try and get back to the more aggressive, high scoring types of offenses. But those offenses obviously use players like Wes Welker, like Julian Edelman. I mean, it could be that Hunter Renfrow is very involved. If this offense is split through three guys, then Davante Adams is not going to have those volume numbers that he had last year in Green Bay.
Yeah, but you make a fair case about sort of his overall talent, and I think a very strong case about how defenses had a harder time shutting him down, taking him away last year in Green Bay. Maybe a little bit more comfortable with his current cost as you talk through that. Diggs, Lamb, Deebo are the other second-round receivers. You had some great thoughts on Deebo as we were kind of just spitballing before the show. Lamb seems to be the one that he's very interesting. I mean, he didn't take the leap forward that we wanted last year. I think he's sort of priced in this range in part because there's not really a clear, better option there. You have Tyreek Hill changing teams. You have Deebo probably changing quarterbacks. You have A.J. Brown changing teams. A lot of the receivers that would be right in this range at this stage in their career are not necessarily pushing Lamb back to where I think he probably should be in a given year, maybe in like the 2-3 turn, as we're still sort of needing to project a skill improvement at this stage of his career that we would have liked to have seen by now. He didn't really take that big leap in targets per run. There's a lot of elements of his game that were maybe a little bit disappointing. At the same time, my case has been he wasn't bad last year. He took a small step forward. And there's still this potential that, he, instead of a traditional second year breakout, he's the old school sort of third year breakout. I mean, again, we were just talking about Cooper Kupp, talking about Stephon Diggs, guys that later in their career really took off. Lamb had his opportunities last year. Gallup got hurt. He started getting used very heavily, running a ton of routes. And when Gallup was back, his route share was down a little bit. There is still some room for Lamb to gain routes, which was the deal after his rookie season, where they were not running him on a 90% plus share of routes per drop back that we would like to see from a first round rookie. In year two, we saw a stretch where he was up there, not for the whole season. You have to assume that's going to improve. So we're with Amari Cooper not there and Lamb now more the clear number one in this passing game. So we should expect more routes, sort of period, straight up, which is a step forward that's easy to project. And the first element. The second element is, can his targets per out run, can his overall targets and volume drawing ability, can it reach elite levels His profile suggests that it can. His college profile, we like to take this long view approach, but hasn't quite been there yet. I mean, I still like him as a bet. It's just a little bit pricier than probably what it should be based on what we've seen through 2 years.
And you mentioned some of the issues with the targets per route, some of the issues with the route percentage. He doesn't pop in terms of target share. He doesn't pop in weighted opportunity. And he wasn't, wildly efficient. He's not a Julio Jones or a Calvin Johnson or an AJ Brown from a physical perspective. You put all that together and it is a hard price because I love this player. I mean, you can use him all over the field. He did drop some catchable passes last year, which was sort of frustrating from a player who needs to kind of make those plays and emerge as the star. For me, it comes down to a lot, how much of this was him and how much of it was the Cowboys trying to prove that other players within this offense still had it. And it seemed like after they lose that playoff game, they decide, oh, you know what? We should go back and design our offense around the actual stars as opposed to these people that we're paying. And so from that perspective, I think there is room for a big jump. If he is one of the stars next season, that wouldn't surprise me. And yet when you have this type of good but not great progress through 2 years, I think you have to at least keep open the possibility that he's just going to be a good player, which, I mean, that's not a criticism. It's just a matter of price here. I was mentioning to you before the show that in a Dynasty League, I did trade him for Treylon Burks and David Bell yesterday. And I mean, I feel okay about that trade because that gives me two possible ways to win. Probably neither of those players are quite the CeeDee Lamb level, but frankly, Treylon Burks has more upside. And so there are still some things about how Lamb compares to other guys to where maybe you want to take a different path with it. I'm hoping that Lamb's price falls into the mid-second and makes him a pretty easy buy. But right now, when you often have to take him ahead of guys like Stephon Diggs and Deebo Samuel, that part I think is difficult because you're getting stars with those players. Now, even though the workload or the volume for Lamb was a big problem last year, I think partly what we're seeing with the price is it's easy to look at the volume for 2022 and say there's actually a lot of room to grow where some of these other guys may fade a little bit. And someone who there are some concerns about the volume would be Deebo Samuel on the other side of it. Part of it is Trey Lance. Part of it is the fact that Brandon Ayuk emerged again down the stretch is a very good player. George Kittle, one of the top 2 or 3 tight ends in the NFL. How do you make all of that work from a volume perspective when you have a quarterback who's going to be playing for the first time? He's in his second year, but it'll be his first year starting. We could see him emerge as a Patrick Mahomes, but the 49ers are not really setting him up that way. They're not setting him up with those types of expectations, which is probably smart, but we're also not really getting the vibe that he's ready to do that. Now, some of the 49ers teammates have made some very positive notes about what he allows the offense to do, kind of contrasting his arm strength, the ability to get those guys open down the field compared to someone like a Jimmy Garoppolo. So there is upside within this. There is an opportunity for him to unlock some of these players. But I think for me with Deebo, the thing that we know is that he is right there with those 3 first-round picks in terms of talent, in terms of what he's demonstrated on the field. Those touchdown runs last season were unsustainable. You're not going to carry the ball from 25 yards out and continually punch it in for touchdowns. But he's unbelievably good. And that's what that illustrates, along with all of the other things that he's done from a target perspective and from a run after the catch perspective. There's just no arguing with how good Samuel is. You break down his season, and it was just these 2 completely different halves, where the first half, he's a receiver. The second half, he's a hybrid player. The first half, he averages 21.2. The second half, 21.6. We expect him to be more similar to the first half, which is the more sustainable portion of it. And the thing that I would say about his price, yes, there are some concerns, and yes, you can project out the 49ers in a way that it makes it look like Samuel probably is a tricky pick in round 2. But Ben, he can lose a couple of points off of what he scored last season, specifically what he scored in the receiving portion. But either way you look at it, those portions were almost identical. He can lose some points and still be a very, very good pick in the second round.
Yeah, I think that's a great case as well. I mean, just good football players, right? I mean, that's an easy way to sum that up. There's a lot of uncertainty as to how the offense might look and all those things. But one of the big keys from everything you were saying is that the Niners understand that he is a huge part of their offense. And they found ways to get the ball into his hands whenever they could. We kind of skipped over Stephon Diggs. I would just say pretty quickly, I mean, the target rate wasn't substantially different. Ended up with almost the same amount of raw targets, played one more game than his 2020 season. Targets per out run did drop a little bit. Bigger concern was that his efficiency dropped a little bit. I'm not really that concerned. There was a lot of sort of missed opportunities I remember last season that I wrote about in Stealing Signals, even when for most of the first half of the year, not just me, but probably anyone who was breaking this down was saying Stephon Diggs is a regression candidate. They've just had some near misses. I remember there was a game where he did finally get into the end zone and had a touchdown, but he basically could have had a 3-touchdown game. Josh Allen missed him on a deep throw. He also missed him wide open in the end zone where he threw it at his feet in the red zone. And he ended up getting a TD later in the game, but it was like, man, he could have had a 3-touchdown game here. That breakout game never really came. They've improved their, ancillary receivers. I think that's probably a good thing. I'm not expecting him to come back out and be 2020 necessarily, but I think 2021 was pretty clearly a below average outcome in terms of, relative to expectation, relative to the player that he is.
I agree with that. I did write a piece for this site. If anyone wants to look in a little bit more detail about a few tiny little red flags, a little bit less dynamic after the catch, he was actually number 2 in the entire NFL last year in terms of air yards per game. And so, they're using him to attack down the field. The targets that he did lose were those really short ones that you like because they give you that sort of PPR floor. One of the things that we mentioned with Diggs, with the Bills, is they used him everywhere as opposed to making him either a short yardage guy or a deep guy, which the Vikings had weirdly swung back and forth in terms of how they had deployed Diggs. I'm hoping that we get a few more of those short targets next season. I hope that he takes them and breaks some tackles and adds those yards after the reception. I hope that Josh Allen is just a little bit more accurate. For all of the brilliance that he demonstrated last season, there were some passes he missed that he could have made. Stephon Diggs, obviously a good pick in the second round.